So hi everyone, welcome to our seminar today. And today we have Dr. Patricia Lawston Parker with us. Patricia is a postdoc associate with ASIC, working in the hydrological science lab and NASA Gather. She joined ASIC in 2017 after receiving her PhD in climate technology and University of Delaware. Her research interests include land and atmosphere interactions, satellite remote sensing of land surface variables, and weather, climate, and land surface modeling. Her research assesses and seeks to improve the representation of irrigation and investigate the impact of irrigation on land surface state, fluxes, and the planetary boundary there. Let's welcome the speaker.
Hi, thank you to John and to ASIC for inviting me to be here today, and thank you to all of you for showing up. I am excited to share with you some of the research that we've been doing at NASA related to observing and modeling irrigation and its impacts on the weather. I hope that at the end of this talk, you'll have a better understanding of how land surface changes, such as irrigation, can impact the atmosphere and the weather. And that because of that, you'll have a better appreciation for why we are taking the steps that we are to model and observe irrigation and its impacts to the weather at NASA. The work that I'll be showing today is a collection of studies that would not have been possible without the input and contribution of the co-authors. In particular, this includes Joe Santinello, Sujay Kumar, Matt Riddell, and Christy Arsenault at NASA Goddard, as well as Brian Hansen, Ben Zajac, and Trenton Franz at their respective universities. In terms of the structure of the talk, I'll start with a little bit of background and science motivation, kind of the conceptual basis for how irrigation could impact the atmosphere. Then the bulk of the talk will be about the modeling of irrigation. So how do we include irrigation in land surface and coupled models? What is the model sensitivity to irrigation? How do we evaluate our models and our irrigation schemes? And lastly, I'll show an application of irrigation modeling to a broader science question. Also important, equally as important, but not quite as well developed in terms of our research to date, is observing of irrigation. So I'll talk about some recent progress that we've made in monitoring irrigation from satellite, the ground, and airborne platforms. And lastly, I'll just finish up with a short discussion of where we hope to take this work in the future. So the broader context for this work is a motivation to better understand how the land and the atmosphere interact. The land and the atmosphere are linked through both the energy and water cycles. So it makes sense that if we have a wide land use change like irrigation, it can impact those cycles and have downstream impacts on the atmosphere. If we look at this complicated diagram of all of the local scale land-atmosphere interactions and feedbacks, it seems kind of overwhelming. Santinello simplified a lot of these interactions into a more manageable process chain that links changes in soil moisture to planetary boundary layer processes and ultimately clouds and precipitation. So for example, if the soil is drier, it could result in greater latent heat flux, which can allow the boundary layer to grow taller and entrain more dry air. And all of that changes the composition of the boundary layer and feeds back onto the surface fluxes. So that's just one example of a dry soil regime, but there are many others. And this is particularly relevant for irrigation modeling and irrigation in general, because the main effect of irrigation is an increase in soil moisture to provide more water for the plants. So we rely on this process chain and the associated metrics in helping to quantify and understand what's happening through the boundary layer because of irrigation. So what is the current status of irrigation modeling in our capabilities at NASA? A main modeling tool that we use at NASA is the Land Information System, or LIS. LIS is a land surface modeling and data assimilation system that allows users to choose from a suite of land surface models and run them with the best available surface and satellite observations. So you can kind of think of this as like a container that allows you to choose the best model and data available for your particular application. I mostly use it to either look at the land surface by itself, land surface processes, in a land-only situation where the complication of atmospheric feedbacks might be a little bit too much. And then we can also use it to provide higher resolution land surface model initial conditions for an atmospheric model. So we'll talk about both of those modes quite a bit. Another model that we use a lot in regional modeling is the Weather Research and Forecasting Model, or WRF. So WRF kind of like chops up the atmosphere into these little cubes upon which the equations that govern the atmosphere are solved. And if you ever took differential equations and think back to that class, you might remember that in order to solve these equations, you need initial and boundary conditions. So for WRF, usually the initial and the boundary conditions for the atmosphere come from reanalysis data. And the lower boundary condition can come from reanalysis or from something a little more complicated like a land surface model. NASA has its own version of WRF called the NASA Unified WRF, or New WRF. So New WRF framework contains all of the features of standard WRF, but has additional model physics that were developed at Goddard. Another major feature for our work is that it allows WRF to be run coupled to the land information system that I talked about earlier. So it basically gives access to WRF of all of the wonderful features available in LIS, which is particularly important for irrigation modeling. So when we do model development and we're interested in understanding land atmosphere processes, it is helpful to do both land-only and coupled modeling. So in a land-only simulation, there is an independent atmosphere, and all of the calculations are done only for the land surface. It's not a two-way feedback process. It's just one way. And then in our coupled LIS-WRF modeling, we have an interactive atmosphere. So the land surface states and fluxes impact the atmosphere and vice versa. So in this first part of our project, we had 3 irrigation schemes that were implemented into LIS, and we wanted to understand how did those irrigation schemes impact both land-only and coupled simulations. So is there really any impact of including these at all? And if so, does it impact the coupled forecasts if we use these irrigated spin-up conditions for our coupled LIS-WRF simulations? If it does, what can it tell us about the way that the boundary layer reacts to irrigation? And can it actually improve our model if we include these features that can be very widespread? So our approach to this was to create a modeling experiment. We looked at this area of the Central Great Plains that includes Nebraska and Kansas and has an irrigation gradient from east to west. So in that figure that is inset, everywhere there's a green dot that indicates an irrigated grid cell. We did long-term land-only simulations, about 5 to 6 years, over this area, and we had flood, drip, and sprinkler irrigation algorithms. Flood saturates the soil moisture at predefined intervals. The drip scheme doesn't add any water, but allows the plants to transpire perfectly. And the sprinkler irrigation method applies irrigation water as precipitation. And there are some thresholds that you can change, so we did 2 different versions of the flood simulation. And a control. So in total, we had 5 different offline runs, or land-only runs, that we completed. And then we use those to initialize coupled LIS-WRF forecasts as well. These are 2-day forecasts, one in a dry year in 2006 and another in a wet year in 2008. And in this case, we used all 5 of the LIS initial conditions, plus we did an additional run where we're not coupled to LIS at all. It's just similar to if you were to download WRF from the internet and run it yourself without any initial conditions from LIS or any coupling to LIS. These are the results of the land-only simulations. And so here we can see that all 4 of the irrigation methods, except for drip, so 3 of the 4 irrigation methods increase the soil moisture. So anywhere that you see color in these plots, that's showing that the soil moisture is increased in that grid cell. And the warmer the color, the more soil moisture increase there is. And on the left panel is the dry regime, and the right panel is the wet regime. So we can also see that the impacts in the dry year are much greater than in the wet year. And that makes sense. That's what we would want to happen, because we would expect that irrigation should turn on more frequently if there's less rainfall. This is the same type of plot, but for latent heat flux. And this same type of patterns are apparent here, where soil moisture has been increased, and that results in more evaporation and latent heat flux. And again, the magnitude is greater in the dry regime than in the wet regime. I didn't show it here in the interest of time, but if we were to look at the sensible heat flux, there's a complementary decrease in the sensible heat flux as well. So these surface changes lead us to believe that there should be some coupled impacts. And we see that in the coupled results, the wetter soil moisture and more latent heat flux results in a decrease in temperature and an increase in humidity, both over and downwind of the irrigated areas. So these changes to temperature and humidity, we would also expect should impact the evolution of the boundary layer. One way that we can try to quantify the impacts to the boundary layer is through coupling diagnostics, like this mixing diagram here. So if you've never seen a plot like this before, the lines on this plot are created by plotting the temperature and humidity at each hour in the daytime in energy space. And then on the x-axis is the moisture energy, and the y-axis is the heat energy. So a point in the bottom right corner would be more moist and cooler than a point plotted in the top left corner. So what these 2 diagrams are showing us is that in the morning, there is a lot of evaporation over the irrigated areas that is moistening the boundary layer. But then later in the afternoon, the vigorous PBL growth entrains a lot of dry air and dries out the PBL. We can also see that there's a lot more spread in the dry year on the left than in the wet year on the right. So this tells us that the PBL is more sensitive to irrigation impacts in a dry year than in a wet year, where everything is kind of collapsed on top of each other. So a natural question is, which of these irrigation methods performs the best, and does including irrigation result in an improvement to the model? This is the temperature and humidity error for all of the simulations. And you can see that all of the LIS-WRF simulations are kind of collapsed on top of each other. And the only line that stands out here is the purple one, which is the kind of normal WRF run without any LIS coupling and without any LIS initial conditions. So it performs slightly worse than all of the LIS-WRF simulations. So this shows us the benefits of using LIS and using a long-term land-only spin-up to initialize our coupled runs. But it doesn't give us any information about the irrigation methods, which is one of the things that we're after. One reason for this is because the observational data that we're using here is just kind of standard observations that are not necessarily in irrigated areas. So it's hard to test this performance specifically for the irrigation when our observations are not over any of those areas. So in general, this studies showed us that there are major sensitivities in the land-only and the coupled simulations to irrigation, but it was very difficult and really not even possible to do a robust evaluation of the actual irrigation physics because we just didn't have the observations at that time to complete such an evaluation. So this leads to the question, how can we evaluate our irrigation schemes with really limited observations? And this is a critical component towards improving our irrigation modeling because we need to know where we're starting to be able to improve. So our approach to trying to evaluate this was to narrow down onto a small region, 15 by 15 kilometer region of eastern Nebraska, where we had a lot of observations, not only of soil moisture and meteorological observations, but also of irrigation practice data. And those were from our partners at the University of Nebraska. So we have this small 15 by 15 kilometer domain. You can see there it's kind of like a patchwork of mostly irrigated, but also some rain-fed fields. And we, again, did land-only simulations for about 6 years using the sprinkler irrigation algorithm only this time, since that is the method of choice for farmers in Nebraska. One of the major things that we wanted to evaluate was the irrigation triggering. So the model determines if it's going to apply irrigation or not based on a series of model checkpoints. And these checkpoints are against the characteristics of each grid cell, which for the most part is determined by the input data sets. So I like to think of these input data sets to the model as kind of like layers over the domain that give each grid cell its characteristics. So the first model checkpoint is against the land cover. So we only want to irrigate areas that are appropriate for irrigation. So this excludes urban areas, bare soil, and forests. Next, there is a check against an irrigation intensity or an irrigation fraction data set. If the irrigation intensity is greater than 0, then it passes that model checkpoint. Next, we don't want to irrigate in the winter. We only want to irrigate during the growing season. So in order to represent this, the model will look at the greenness for the grid cell and compare it to a threshold. The idea being if the grid cell is green enough, it is implying that there's enough vegetation, it's probably the growing season and an appropriate time to add irrigation. And lastly, we only want to irrigate if the soil is dry and the plants require it. So there's a final check of the root zone moisture availability against a threshold related to how much water the soil can actually hold. So if a grid cell passes all of those checkpoints, then irrigation will be applied as precipitation in the morning between 6 and 10 a.m. We did a series of model iterations for this part where we changed the input data sets that are important to the triggering related to the irrigation intensity and the greenness, just to see how dependent the triggering and the amount of water applied is on each of those data sets. And then we looked at the results at lots of different scales. And so we see here that at the long time scales, at the interannual and seasonal time scales, with respect to amount of irrigation water applied and the fluxes, there's very little spread between the models. So the choice of data set here is not particularly important at these longer time scales. But at subseasonal and daily time scales, like in this bottom figure, the fluxes produced by the model can change quite a bit based on the data set that's being used to trigger the irrigation. So this scale is important for our coupled model simulations. So this just helps us to know that it's important to be using the best data sets available for irrigation intensity and greenness, and also to know the limitations of the data sets that are being used in interpreting the results that we get from the model. So how do the model simulations compare to all of these observations that we have from the University of Nebraska? Our collaborator there was able to provide us with soil moisture from 3 different sites, 2 of which were irrigated and 1 was rain-fed. At the 2 irrigated sites, we also had irrigation information, when irrigation was applied and how much irrigation was applied. So that combination of data is really critical to this type of evaluation. We also had a gridded soil moisture product from this group, and they were able to obtain that in kind of a unique way. They had this cosmic ray neutron sensor that they installed on the bed of a pickup truck that you see here. And then they drive this pickup truck up and down the farm roads in Nebraska, and it counts the number of neutrons that it senses as it drives over this area. And then they can relate the number of neutrons that are counted by the sensor to an actual soil moisture estimate. So we're able to get gridded soil moisture over the area of our modeling domain, which is also really unique. So when we look at the information from the soil moisture probes at one of the irrigated sites and the rain-fed site, then we see that the irrigation schemes make the soil moisture dynamics more realistic than they would be if we didn't include irrigation. So on the left, over the course of the season, when the rains dry up, late in July, the control run, which doesn't include irrigation, dries out. But the irrigated runs maintain the soil moisture because of the irrigation schemes turning on. And those end up closer to observations, which are the black line there, much better than the control run. At the irrigated site, though, or excuse me, at the rain-fed site, the irrigation schemes actually result in a degradation of the model because the irrigation intensity data set is not quite correct here. And so it classifies this site, which is rain-fed, as irrigated and keeps the soil moisture much higher than it should be. So overall, the soil moisture impacts resulting from the irrigation scheme over irrigated grid cells are simulated really well when the irrigation intensity data set is accurate. We also compared our model simulations for the whole run and the whole domain to our gridded spatial data set that we got from the University of Nebraska. And that shows on the left that the field scale heterogeneity that is captured from that roving truck is really not represented well in our model at all, probably because our resolution isn't quite as good as it needs to be, but also because it's kind of missing some of the interseasonal timing of irrigation. So all of the colors in this plot on the left are pretty far from the black line, which is the observation. But on the right, when we look at irrigated and non-irrigated grid cells separately over the whole season, then we see that the seasonal timing of irrigation is simulated pretty well, and that the irrigation schemes help to improve the soil moisture dynamics over irrigated areas. So this study helped us to understand a lot of ways that the model was performing well, and also highlighted some deficiencies in the model that require more work to be done. So the seasonal timing is done well in the model, and the impacts to the soil moisture over irrigated areas can be simulated well at longer time scales. But we need more observations of irrigation practices to improve how we're representing the intraseasonal timing in the model. And that field scale heterogeneity is not quite represented as well as it could be either. So there's still more work to be done in this case. So why do we even do any of this model development? How can irrigation modeling help to advance our scientific understanding of land-atmosphere interactions in agricultural areas? So we have a paper in review right now that I think is a good example of how models with irrigation can help to complement and support observation-based analyses. So in this study, we're focused on a heavily irrigated area of central Washington state. The irrigation acres in this area exploded dramatically starting around about 1950 after the completion of the Columbia Basin Project infrastructure. So the Columbia Basin Project was a federally funded program to build canals and dams to deliver irrigation water to farmers within the project area. And the project area here is outlined in black. So knowing that timeline, we analyzed the global historical climate network data for temperature, maximum daily temperature, at each of the sites that you see marked in yellow here. And what we found is that there was a correlation between an increase in irrigated acres and a reduction in the maximum daily temperature in the summertime at some of the sites downwind of the Columbia Basin Project area. And then we were able to use our model with irrigation enabled to kind of test this hypothesis and see if it makes sense that the irrigation impacts could change the boundary layer processes in a way to support that this irrigation effect could reach these downwind sites. And it did confirm that, but this is still in review, so I don't want to talk too much more about it. So observations of irrigation practices are really critical to improving our understanding of land-atmosphere interactions in agricultural areas, not only through the data itself, but also as input to the model and for using it to evaluate our model simulations. So a second angle that we've been working on more recently is how do we improve how we're observing or monitoring irrigation? In terms of observing irrigation from satellite, we were able to show recently that SMAP, the Soil Moisture Active Passive Satellite, was able to detect the spatial signature and seasonal timing of irrigation in 3 semi-arid regions of the western US. So for this study, we used not only SMAP soil moisture data, but also daily precipitation data from NSEP, MODIS data, and USDA crop bulletins. And we analyzed this in a lot of different ways, but in the interest of time, I'll just show a couple of figures from Northern California in the Sacramento Valley. Rice is the major product in the Sacramento Valley. So on the left there is a map of the crop type from the USDA. And what you see is that bright blue color popping out. That's all rice agriculture. And on the right are images that show just how dramatically this type of agriculture changes the landscape. On the right, on the top panel, these are MODIS true color reflectance images, and on the bottom is the SMAP soil moisture retrieval for February on the left and July on the right. So in February, everything is kind of uniformly wet. We don't see too much of a pattern in the soil moisture data or much of a spatial signature of any type of agriculture in the MODIS data either. But by July, everything has kind of dried out except at the center of that valley where the irrigated agriculture is taking place. So there in the SMAP data, we see these bright blue colors where the rice is being grown, and it matches up spatially with where we know agriculture is occurring. If we define an irrigated and a non-irrigated point and plot the soil moisture from SMAP over an entire year with the rainfall from a local rain gauge, we can see that the time series track together in the winter when there's a lot of rainfall. So the blue and the red are reacting similarly to the precipitation that's occurring in the winter time. But in the spring, when the rains kind of end, the non-irrigated site, which is shown in red, dries out. And the irrigated site actually increases in soil moisture, which is opposite the rainfall signal. But this increase in soil moisture is consistent with USDA crop bulletins that show that farmers in this area are planting the rice at this time, which means that they're flooding the fields and seeding the fields from airplanes at this time. So overall, SMAP was able to show the spatial signature and seasonal timing of irrigation in some of these semi-arid regions in the western US. Switching gears now to the ground and airborne campaigns. We were involved in the Great Plains Irrigation Experiment, which took place in 2018 in eastern Nebraska. This is an NSF-funded project, and they were able to deploy lots of different meteorological met sensors over the season, about 70 of them. They also had some flex towers and vertical profilers. There were 2 intensive observation periods, one in early June and another in late July. And during those, they had more frequent radiosonde launches. They also had a couple of Doppler on wheels from NCAR during that time. And Ed Kim and Joe Santinello at NASA were able to arrange for GRAINEX to fly on a plane at the same time. So GRAINEX is an instrument that is similar to SMAP and can be used in an airborne platform to observe spatially continuous soil moisture between a lot of these stationary sites. This Doppler on wheels is Doppler 3, I believe, which was on the Discovery Channel show Storm Chasers back in the day. If anybody watched that, I was pretty excited about that when I was able to go to Dow 3. So the main thing that I hope you take away from this talk today is that irrigation is an important anthropogenic modification to the weather cycle, and it deserves inclusion in weather and climate models. Our land-only and coupled simulations show that there is a sensitivity to irrigation, and that the soil moisture dynamics can be improved by including irrigation. But there's still more to be done, and we need to acquire more and better observations of irrigation practices to really keep pushing the boundaries of this forward. We hope to continue this work in the future. One way that we are expecting to do that is through a NOAA-funded climate process team project. This is being led by Nate Cheney at Duke University, and it's just starting up now. There are PIs and co-Is from all of the major US modeling, climate modeling centers. And the goal of this project is to create a new parameterization to improve the land heterogeneity and the coupling to the atmosphere. So the way that GCMs work now is we have a coarse grid cell, and we can improve the land heterogeneity by using tiling for the land. And now there are similar ways to improve the heterogeneity of the atmosphere as well. But ultimately, it's still an average value that's being passed from the land to the atmosphere and vice versa. And so the goal of this project is to come up with a new parameterization that would retain some of that heterogeneity in both directions. So there's a lot of work to be done with this, but ultimately when we have this new parameterization, then we would like to test it in the context of land heterogeneity resulting from irrigation. We also have a proposal into the SMAP mission science team solicitation, where we hope to use SMAP satellite data and other satellite data to improve our irrigation modules and to couple them with a crop model. And we had one additional proposal that was into the eco-stress science team solicitation, but we recently found out that that was denied. But there is some value, I think, in the eco-stress data, which is a thermal infrared sensor that we can use to extract information about irrigation and hopefully use that in one of our other projects coming up, even though it won't be a dedicated funding. So that's all I have. I'd be glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, it's a good talk. So my question is that in the beginning of this talk, you show the complex interactions between the boundary layer and soil moisture, right? So the irrigation can increase the soil moisture, which can have large effects on the boundary layer development, which can feed back to the soil moisture. So, but here you just show that inclusion of the irrigation can improve the moisture modeling, but it did not show how the complex feedbacks between the boundary layer can contribute to this more accurate soil modeling, because I think it's very straightforward that the moisture modeling can be improved. But to what degree the boundary layer feedbacks can contribute to this kind of better performance? So can you talk about that?
Yes, so I agree with you. And I would like to talk to you more afterwards because there were more details that I didn't want to include in the interest of time. But some of that feedback onto the land surface depends on the PBL parameterization that you're using. And so it is, you know, it's not kind of a straightforward, this is the way that it happens all the time. There are multiple dependencies, not only specific to and the type of parameterization, but also the regime of the atmosphere on whatever day you're modeling it.
Okay, thank you.
So in the modeling result in the middle of your talk, you show the spatial variability is really bad, but the temporal variability, can you explain why that's the case, and is it consistent with your modeling result?
So in this case, for that particular study, the domain was very small. It was only 15 by 15 kilometer resolution, and the model resolution was 1 kilometer. So we have 1 kilometer grid cells that are being compared to a soil moisture product that was derived from that truck going up and down the farm fields. So the resolution of that soil moisture product, I believe, was about 250 meters. And so it probably would have been a little bit more appropriate to scale that up to a 1 kilometer resolution before doing that comparison. But that's the reason why the field scale variability isn't able to be captured, because we're just not at spatial resolution yet for that to be true. The seasonal timing, the seasonal dynamics are simulated really well, because when we're looking from May through September, a lot of that signal is coming from the rainfall events. So we're capturing those really well in the forcing data. So every time there's precipitation, it's increasing the soil moisture, and that performance is due, I would say, mostly in part to the model itself, not necessarily the irrigation component of it. But even so, when we split out the irrigated and the non-irrigated areas, the irrigated matches pretty well with the irrigated observations and vice versa. So there's just, I would say, more factors that are contributing to that improvement over the longer time scale of the season.
So is it the precipitation actually?
The precipitation is a large
dominant in
yes,
terms
over
of
the season.
Soil moisture, right? So
yes.
Your irrigation, you have to separate into the irrigated land and the non-irrigated land in order to see some impact.
Yes, and even when we do separate them, we still see that the irrigated schemes match the irrigated CDF better. So I'll go back to it and show.
Okay.
So here are the dashed lines. The dashed black line is the observations over non-irrigated areas. And the blue dashed line is the model non-irrigated areas. And similarly, the black line and the other colors are the irrigated grid cells and the irrigated area observations.
And those are over a much limited area where you actually
Yes.
have observation, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so it would be a small percentage of your entire domain.
Yes.
Okay, you didn't mention that point.
Well, in this particular one, our domain is mostly irrigated because it's a small area. But if you were to have a, 500 by 600 kilometer domain like in the first study, then the irrigated area will be a smaller percentage of that. But in this case, it's quite large.
So, Patricia, I enjoy your talk. So, if I understand correctly, in your modeling, you actually do not use the dynamic vegetation or any crop. So that means like the root zone system and the vegetation, like the AOAI, all these does not feed back to the system.
Correct. Yes.
So what's your plan next?
So we hope that we will be funded by the SMAP mission team. And if we are, then that project would couple the irrigation and the crop model in NOAA MP so that we can feed back the irrigation to the crop health and vice versa. Because we think that that can help us to improve the timing within the season for irrigation. That is one of the biggest issues that we're facing at the moment. So I hope that we get a chance to do that.
So our group do a lot, the coupled climate and crop modeling since 2003, so funded by USDA. So we have done some of these so-called auto irrigation in the crop model. Then you found a very difficult time in the Midwest for how to set up this irrigation. And if you don't tune the model carefully about how the threshold being held, the interannual variability of crop yield is very bad. So I think it's from the long-term run. If you fully couple the climate and crop, that will show even more impacts, larger impacts than currently you show.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to talk about that more.
Okay, questions? Okay, so with that, let's wrap up. And thanks to the speaker again.